What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So today's video, we're going to be going over replacing the wheel bearings on the front of my Mercedes E-Class. This is a W211 chassis. This repair should apply to all W211 chassis if they're two-wheel drive. It may also apply to the previous generation E-Class as well as the generation after that. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that, but I know it covers all these W211 chassis. If you guys have watched any of the videos on my channel, you know that in the past I did a suspension replacement on this corner due to stuff being bent for this accident. When I replaced the suspension, the steering knuckle, and everything on this corner, I replaced the wheel bearings over here just because I wanted to make sure that everything was going to be okay while I was in there doing the work. But I didn't do the other side because I wasn't having any problems. Well, the last time I did the oil change, which is about a month ago, a couple thousand miles ago, 1,000 miles ago or so, I did your basic vehicle check, making sure things are tight and there's no problems. And I noticed that this front wheel bearing on the passenger side had a little bit of play in it. Well, these wheel bearings are a spindle and bearing type, kind of like an older two-wheel drive pickup truck. So they can be adjusted if they get play in them over time. And I attempted to adjust this. I didn't really follow the repair instructions and torque the nut to spec to take the slack out of it. I just tried to do it by feel. I apparently over-tightened it, and within a couple days of tightening it up, I started to get wheel bearing noise from this corner. I tried adjusting it again after that, and it didn't change anything. I apparently tightened it too tight and probably locked the bearing up a little bit and caused it to get a flat spot in it, which is what's causing my bearing noise. So we're going to go over replacing the bearings on this corner. It's pretty simple and straightforward. I'm going to go over taking, tire off, brake rotor off, all that stuff, and getting torn down to pulling the bearings out. I'm going to show you how to pack the new bearings. You can either use a bearing packing tool, which I don't actually have right now, or do it by hand. I will show you guys how to do that. And then we're going to get everything put back together and go drive it and make sure that our noise is gone. So let's get to it. All right, so the first thing you're going to do, you're going to take a tire off. Obviously, if you guys are doing work on your car, you know how to take a tire off of a car. 17mm bolts holding that on. Once you get your tire off, you're going to take, first thing I'm going to do, and you should do, brake caliper off. 2 18mm bolts, top and bottom, holding the brake caliper on. Make sure you get something like a bungee cord or a coat hanger or something like that to hang this caliper by. Don't let it hang by the hose or any of the wiring, because you can break stuff. I normally loop it through the holes in the brake caliper or through the bracket itself, and then hang it off of the steering knuckle or the upper control arm or strut. So I'm going to get this off, and then after you get that off, you're going to take your brake rotor off. There's a screw here. It's a T30. You're going to take that T30 off, and your brake rotor is going to come off, and you're going to have access to your hub. So I'm going to get the caliper off and the brake rotor off, and then I'm going to show you guys how to take the hub itself off. All right, so we got our brake rotor off. I will forewarn you guys, try to get as good of a bite as you can in that screw before trying to take it loose, because it can and will strip out. I'm gonna have to try to find something that I have that will replace this, but obviously this is a possibility on any repair that you're doing. Luckily I have the tools to get it out, but just make sure that your Torx bit is actually biting in there hard enough to not strip it out when you're trying to break it loose. Now that we've got that out and our brake rotor off, we gotta get this dust cap off. I don't know what the correct procedure is for taking this dust cap off. Usually it just pries right off, which this one is going to. Put your screwdriver in this little gap here. Just pop that off. So once you get this off, you're going to set it off to the side. Now we're at our wheel bearing itself. So you can see that I'm turning this, and it's a little, you guys can't really tell, but I can feel it. It's a little, it gets spots where it's like tight. So that's the reason why we're getting our noise, is because it just has a spot in it where it's tight. So this is a very interesting lock nut here that holds everything together. There is a pinch. This is like a pinch nut. There's a screw that runs through here on this side. It's a 6mm Allen, and you loosen that up, which loosens up the clamping force on this nut. And then this nut itself has these flats on it, and then you just use a wrench that's the right size or a pair of pliers to break this nut loose and back it off, and then we can pull this whole hub off. So we're gonna get that Allen screw out. Usually like to use a swivel Allen. I'm sorry, it's not a 6, it's a 5. I like to use the ball style Allen. Just, it's not actually that tight. ball style on, loosen things up. And then I use a pair of channel locks style pliers to loosen the nut up. And then once you get the nut loosened up, you can take it off by hand. I will forewarn you guys that this is a very messy process. You're going to be dealing with all this wheel bearing grease and everything like that while you're doing it. Set our nut off to the side, and then you can pull your hub off. So this is your outer wheel bearing, and then in the back here, underneath this seal is your inner wheel bearing. So I'm going to get this seal pulled out so we can pull this inner wheel bearing out. We're going to clean everything up, and then we're going to repack everything with new grease and put everything back together. So I'm going to go over to the bench. We're going to get this this seal popped off so we can get this back bearing out, and then I'm going to walk you through repacking these bearings, putting them back together, tapping our seal back in, and then we'll go back together with everything. All right, so obviously our front bearing kind of just falls out once you take the nut off. The back bearing, like I said, is held in with this seal on the back. This is the seal that you're trying to pull out. This is our replacement one. One thing I do want to warn you guys of, I don't know how much it'll matter, just be careful when you're doing this old one and putting this new one in, is because this actually has the pickup slots in it for the wheel speed sensor. The way that I know that, and you can tell that, just, you know, a little note, is see how you can see all these like little serrations around the edge of it where stuff has stuck to certain areas but not others. That is where metal particles are sticking to the bars that are the pickup for the speed sensor. So when you take anything apart and you see that like little serration style, or like, I don't even know what to call it, like sawtooth or like pattern like that, that's a pickup for a wheel speed sensor, just to let you guys know. So I'm going to attempt to take this out with the seal puller here on the bench. I may end up having to put it in the vise, but what you're going to want to do is take this seal out so that you can get your wheel bearing out. Alright, I'm going to end up having to put that in the vise. I cannot hold that down myself. If you don't have a vise, obviously you can have somebody help you hold it, step on it, whatever. So I'm going to get this popped out, and I'm going to pull the wheel bearing out. We're going to show you guys what the wheel bearings look like. I'm going to repack them, show you how to repack them, and then we're going to put them back together. Alright, so we got our seal popped off. These are our old bearing, just the bearing parts, outer and inner, and then that's our new stuff. So your new bearings are going to come with new races for them. Now you can do this step if you want to. I suggest doing it just so that you know that you have a completely new bearing and race setup. You can also inspect your old races and determine for yourself whether or not you feel like they need to be tapped out and replaced. Just because I had wheel bearing noise, I'm going to be replacing mine because it could be some waviness to the bearing race itself that's causing that noise. If you're just doing this as like a service procedure and you didn't have any noise or anything like that beforehand, then you may potentially be able to just leave the races in there and just replace the bearings themselves. But I recommend doing the races while you're in here. In order to do that, they're pressed in, they're not pressed in too tight. You're gonna have to tap them out with a punch and a hammer. Now, I cleaned all my grease out of here in order to be able to show you guys what what I'm doing. You don't necessarily have to do that. You can leave all that grease packed in there and do this just by putting this down in here. But down in here, this is from the back side of the hub, looking towards the front of the hub. You're gonna take a punch, preferably smaller tip, decent sized tip, and down in here along this side here, there is, you like run down the side of the hub and you'll get to a stopping point. It's like the very last lip in there. That's actually the back side of this smaller race where it's pressed into the hub. So what you're gonna do is you're actually gonna get that punch down in there to where it's to that edge, and then you're gonna hit it with a hammer and it'll tap this race out of there. Obviously be careful when you guys are doing this because your race can definitely go flying. It'll tap out to the point where it hits whatever you're on. You're gonna have to elevate this hub itself. You can potentially put the wheel studs or bolts back in and set it up on those because they stick out far enough to give you a little bit of space for this to be tapped out. So we knock that race out, and we're gonna flip this over and we're gonna knock the other race out. Now again, like I said, you're gonna have to go in from the back side. You're gonna see the back edge of the lip of it in there, and you're gonna have to elevate this part of it. You can either put this over top of something so that that race has someplace to go, or if you have a vise or something like that, you can put it in the vise like that, sit it down in the vise like this and hit it so that it has someplace to go out the bottom is what you're aiming for. So let's get this this back race tapped out. All right, so we got both of our bearing races tapped out of there. Sometimes the punch is a little bit hard to get to sit on that lip just because of how thin it is. If they're having a hard time with a punch or a screwdriver or anything like that, you can use a chisel as well, or a screwdriver if you know that's what you're limited to. Just make sure if you're doing this with a screwdriver or anything like that you're wearing eye protection while you're doing it. You obviously don't want to get anything that breaks off and comes flying into your eye. So we got both races punched out of there. We're going to work on getting our new ones back in there now. So you just want to clean up this area down in here and make sure that there's nothing blocking you, because these are actually a little tight press fit in here, and you want to not make sure that there's any debris or anything like that from stopping you from getting them punched in there. So we are going to get everything cleaned up in here, and then I'm going to show you guys how to punch your new or tap your new races back in there. All right, so we got everything cleaned up on this side. So next step is to tap your new race in. So you can either use a race setting tool. These are relatively cheap and easy to get a hold of. Your parts store has one. You can also order them from Amazon a couple days out as far as delivery goes. You can also use your old bearing race to tap it back in there, and then just hit that race with a hammer. You just don't want to hit this race with a hammer, because any nicks or scratches or anything that you make on this race is going to affect the bearing sitting in it. So I have the access to this race setting tool, so I'm going to use this, but like I said, you can use your old bearing race. All right, we got it tapped in there all the way. Obviously, combination of things to make sure it goes in there straight. I don't actually have the right size thing for this bearing setter. I have kind of like a broken up kit, but I got it in there. We're gonna flip this over and we're gonna get the other side, the other new bearing race tapped in. Obviously, make sure, note to you guys, the taper comes towards the outside of this hub from either side. So when you're putting the back bearing in, the flatter side of this race goes towards the middle, and then when you're putting the front bearing race in, the flatter side of that race goes towards the middle as well. So I'm going to get this front race tapped in, and I'm going to show you guys how to pack the wheel bearings, the new wheel bearings, and put them in. All right, so we got our races both pressed in there, got everything cleaned up a little bit. I don't have the factory style grease, it's green that they used, but I'm going to be using this red wheel bearing grease that I have access to. I'm not sure what the correct grease is. I will put a link in the description if I figure it out between now and posting the video. I'm not really all that concerned about it. I feel like wheel bearing grease is wheel bearing grease, but I may be wrong, but I'm going to use what I've always used to do wheel bearings. So I don't know if this is necessary, but obviously there was a lot of grease packed into the area in this wheel bearing between the two races. I don't know how much of that grease is necessary. I'm going to pack grease back in there. Just, I guess it's probably there so that the bearings themselves have access to grease, or there's ability for the grease to work its way out into the wheel bearings. I don't know. Like I said, I'm just going to repack it the way it was when I took it apart. I don't know if that's necessary though. So that's not anything that I really need to show you guys. I'm gonna show you guys how to repack wheel bearings without a wheel bearing packing tool. I believe older video I actually redid the wheel bearings on the front of Ford Ranger, and I showed you guys how to do this, but it's pretty straightforward. If I do a poor job of describing it, there's videos on the internet describing it as well. I will put a link in the description of those too. It's pretty straightforward. You're gonna take your grease that you're using, you're gonna put some of it on the palm of your, realistically the best option is your offhand, and then what you're going to do is you're going to take your new wheel bearing, and on the wider side, its cage is actually a little bit more open on that side, is you're going to work the wheel bearing grease into that negative space in between there. And what all you're doing is just using hydraulic pressure, I guess you want to say, and pushing that grease through that wheel bearing. No different than a bearing packer would, but this is just the old school way of doing it without having a bearing packer. So you're just going to press the grease into the bottom groove of this race for the bearing. And when you keep pressing it in there, it'll work its way up behind those bearings and get in there and get all, lubricated properly. Obviously, a wheel bearing packer is a lot better at doing this and works better, but you might not have access to that, and I want to show you guys how to pack these wheel bearings properly without needing to have a wheel bearing packer. So just keep doing that all the way around the bearing. And obviously you want clean gloves, clean work area when you're doing this, because you don't want any grit or dirt or contaminants to get into this grease that you're packing in here, because this is the grease that you're packing into the bearing itself to replace, to put back in the car. So obviously you don't want any grit or anything like that in the bearing itself, because it can cause damage to it. So what you're looking for, and if you look here inside this race here, is you see in between the rollers, the bearing grease is starting to poke through or pop up through in between the rollers. That's what you're focusing on. So you see like right here, up in this corner up here, it's starting to push through. That's what you want to do all the way around, is just work it until that bearing grease pushes up between the inner race and the cage and gets in behind that bearing. So I'm going to continue packing this in here, and I'm going to show you guys what the finished bearing pack looks like. I just want to show you guys on a cleaner bearing that I haven't got all goopy. If you look up here at the top in between the inner race and the cage, see how that grease is starting to poke through? That's from you pressing it into your hand enough times that it pressed it through the backside up between the bearings and the race, and it's not coming back out the top. That's how you know that you have grease in behind all those rollers. Once you get it like that, you can move on to the next section, and then you just want to make sure you see that happen the whole way around the bearing, and then you know it's packed right. All right, so we got our bearings packed. As you can see, we have even packing in around the race on both sides. Make sure you do it until you get the little fingers coming up from between the bearings and the race itself, all the way around. And then once you do that, you can then put some grease in through the top here so that it's sealed off to where you're not seeing the bearings from the top or the bottom. And then you want to coat your outside as well. I also got the inside of this packed up with grease really well, as like it was before. Like I said, I don't know if that's necessary, but I just wanted to make sure that I was doing, covering my bases and making sure that everything had enough grease. So in order to go back on the car, we have to put our back bearing in, the larger bearing. You're going to drop it into the race in here. And then we have to put our new seal on the back. That seal is not only a seal as well as a retaining ring that holds that bearing in place. So you're going to take your new seal, and then preferably you want something that's the same size as it. Like I said, you could use your old seal to tap it in, or you want to have something flat like a block of wood or anything like that to tap it in. So I'm going to get this tapped in. We're going to get everything, buttoned up here, and then we're gonna go back over to the car and we're gonna get this put on, get our outer bearing put on, and then we're going to show you guys how to adjust that nut and make sure that it's torqued and tightened down properly and set properly, so you don't have any issues with this being too tight or too loose and causing, you know, other problems. All right, so we're back over on the car. We got our wheel hub put back on. We're gonna take our front bearing and place it in there. And then once you place the front bearing in there, clean my fingers off, we're gonna put our nut back on. Obviously you wanna clean the nut off so it doesn't have all the old grease and grit and grime and stuff all over it, because that stuff will get back into the new. And then the side that has the numbering and lettering out on it is actually the outside. So I'm gonna put this nut on. Now the instructions for doing this, setting this, require a dial indicator. I don't have one that can set up for doing this. I'm sure most of you don't either. So what I've done, and I did on the other side, and it seemed to work okay. Like I said, I tightened it out. I think I tightened this side up a little bit too tight before, or it could have just been that the slack in it was hiding the fact that it had a bad spot in the wheel bearing. I don't know. What I did on the other side, and it seemed to work out just fine, is the way that I've tightened every single this style like spindle and hub bearing that I've ever done in my entire life, is you leave this loose to where there's some play and everything, okay? Got some play in it. And then you tighten this up until it presses everything in and you get no play. And what you're kind of doing is setting the bearing in there. And what you want to do is you want to tighten it and turn it, tighten it and turn it, tighten it and turn it. You don't want to tighten it too tight. Obviously, I'm doing this by hand. In the past, and on the other side, I actually did it with a pair of pliers, but you know, keep tightening it and turning it until you get it to the point that you can't tighten it by hand anymore. Usually it's with a pair of small pliers, but I'm doing this by hand just because of, I believe I might have had an issue in the past with tightening it too tight. So I'm gonna tighten this. What you do is when you're tightening it and then spinning it like this, is it kind of allows the bearings to like set into the races properly, because obviously they're not going to, like, they might be crooked or whatever. So turning it and then tightening it, turning it and tightening it is setting everything together into like the tightest position they possibly can be. And then obviously now we are at a point where I feel like this is tight enough and we're not getting any more tightening out of it by hand. I don't want to over tighten it, so what I'm probably going to end up doing is tightening this up and torquing this down and get everything put back together and go drive the car for a little bit and then come back and recheck it. The proper way to check it is actually with a dial indicator. You're supposed to put the brake rotor on, set the dial indicator up here on your steering knuckle, and you're supposed to measure end play or play of the rotor or the hub itself, and you're supposed to tighten it up so the play is, you know, within specification, and then you tighten this Allen and you're done. I believe the play is probably allowing for a little bit of slop in here just because they don't want it to be too tight because it can mess the bearings up or cause excess heat in here. I don't feel like tightening this up by hand is going to squeeze this together and put too much stress on all this stuff and cause too much heat. I could be wrong, but like I said, I'm going to put this together. I'm going to tighten this Allen screw up, put my cap back on, put everything back together. I'm going to go drive the car for a little bit, and I'm going to pull it back in here and pull the wheel off and pull the cap back off and see if this is loosened up at all. So I'm going to get this button back up, and then we're going to go through the rechecking it later on. All right, guys, so I've driven the car for day and a half now. I believe it's 2 days ago that we did the wheel bearing work on this. Like I told you, I tightened it up, I snugged it up the way it was supposed to be snugged up. There was no play in it, and I've driven on it for a couple days now, probably put 50 miles on it, and I wanted to show you guys that there's actually a little bit of play in it. You can hear that clicking. I want to show you. I don't know if you can really are going to be able to see anything, but there is play. In that wheel bearing again. So I'm going to take the wheel back off and we're going to tighten it back up the same way that we did before, just to get all that slop out of it. What happens is those bearings, if you put some weight on them and put some load through everything, kind of seat in a little bit more than what you can on the lift, and then you got to readjust it. So I'm going to readjust this and we're going to show you what it should sound like / look like when everything's tightened up the way it's supposed to be. Alright, so got everything snugged back up. We tightened it up, spun our rotor, snugged our nut up again, just a little bit, just by hand. I actually didn't do it by hand. I did it using these pliers, but you just kind of use your judgment on how tight you're tightening this. Like I said, there's a spec that you're supposed to mount a dial indicator to the steering knuckle and then to the face of the rotor and feel the play. I don't have a dial indicator set up for that. I'm doing this the exact same way I did the driver's side when I did all the other suspension work, and if I do this properly, it should have no problems, just like the driver's side did. So I snugged this back up. As you can hear, there's no play left in this, so all of our issues should be gone. Obviously, I've driven it for the last day or two. I don't have any noise anymore, so the wheel bearing fixed my wheel bearing noise. Now we're just making sure that everything's tight the way it's supposed to be. So all done with this job. If you guys have any questions about anything in this video, please comment down below. I'll be sure to answer any questions you guys have. I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you later.